I'm Andrea Griffiths, a la Colombia dev, and I am so excited to be here with one of my most favorite people in the entire world. Welcome, Zeke. Zeke is a designer and engineer who's worked on developer tools at companies like Heroku, VM, and GitHub, and that's how we know each other.
Yep.
And you love building abstractions that make it easier for normal humans to build powerful things with computers. Now you're at Replicate, which is what we're going to talk about today. Replicate is a platform that makes it easy for software developers to build and scale AI applications. Welcome.
Thank you. Yeah, so happy to see you again. It's been a while.
You were the founding engineer at Replicate back in, 2021?
Yeah, that's right.
First of all, for folks who might not know, what is a founding engineer, if you don't mind?
Yeah, I'm still trying to figure that out. Actually, I think I'm a founding designer on paper. I haven't done a lot of pixel pushing in the design sense. I don't spend a lot of time in Figma. It's more like the design of the developer experience of the product that we've built at Replicate.
Awesome.
That's the way I like to think of it.
Tell us a little bit about the thought process behind the creation of Replicate. Creating a platform makes all these AI models accessible through cloud APIs. Original vision, how has it evolved to the company that is now almost 4 years later?
Sure. In 2021, I was working at GitHub doing internationalization stuff, which is how I first started working with the Octogatos, the employee resource group for Hispanohablantes. I was having a lot of fun working on that. Right around that time, the early version of Copilot came out. And so all of a sudden, everyone has this capability in their editors to hit tab and it auto-completes your code for you. And that was the first mind-blowing experience around, oh, wow, this stuff is really capable. And I don't have to go to Google and then go to Stack Overflow and then copy and paste and try it again. While that was happening, I was also making friends with some new people in Berkeley who were starting something new, and they were calling it Replicate. They had just gone through Y Combinator and were still figuring out what they were building. And so I met with the founders. Andreas had been a machine learning researcher at Spotify, where he did things like source separation, where you take an audio file and you run it through a machine learning model that separates the vocal track from all the instrumental tracks.
That's fascinating.
So that you can classify the music, or you can change the volume level of individual instruments and things like that. So Andreas had worked at Spotify building sophisticated machine learning models, but every time he wanted to show them to his product manager grandmother, he had no way of easily demonstrating the capabilities of those models because he had to have a specialized computer with GPUs. He had to have all this software. So every time he wanted to do a demo, he would stand up a new web server and connect all this Python code just to be able to show off the capabilities of the model. So that's how Replicate came to be. It was like machine learning can do really powerful things, but people don't necessarily yet have the tools to be able to share what they're creating.
So it was about making it accessible for you to be able to showcase what you're building too?
Yeah, so we've mostly worked with a lot of academics and researchers. A lot of these impressive innovations in the world of deep learning, machine learning, and AI are coming out of academia. A few years back, that was where almost all of the innovation was happening. Researchers are working in these labs at their university campus, and they have a specialized GPU cluster where they can run their code. They don't have experience taking something they're working on and figuring out how to actually package it and share it with the world. We spent a lot of time working with researchers, and the first version of Replicate was just an open source tool called Cog and a website that you could use to package a model, push it to a package registry as a Docker container, and then run it on replicate.com with a URL where you could send it to your friends or your colleagues and say, go to this page, you fill out a form, and you can see you put in the inputs and you can see the outputs of my model. And so researchers were so excited about this because it gave them a way to share their work with the world when previously it had just been locked up in a PDF, like an academic paper. So that's how it got started. We got to interview all these really exciting and interesting people from around the world. But what we discovered while building it is that all these people were starting to tinker with open source image generation. This was before DALL-E came out. Google had created this Deep Dream image generation model that created these weird hallucinations of images, but you were starting to see
That was the direction it was trending, right? I feel like we had an installation like that at Universe a few years ago, around that time.
Yeah, it was all very psychedelic. And
Exactly,
kind of like,
yes. So what happened then?
at that time, I was skeptical when I first joined Replicate or when I first was meeting with them because I was like, this whole sort of fish with 1,000 eyeballs kind of thing doesn't really seem to me like the future.
Right.
But what they realized was that was just the really early days. So as more of this work started to move out of the confines of academia and into open source and more stuff started to happen on GitHub, it got into the hands of more people who were really excited about it. People started pushing their own models to Replicate that could do new and interesting things. We started to realize that there was a shift. Part of the issue is that when academics do their work, they're trying to get a paper published so they can
Fund their lab.
as soon as they finish the paper, they're done with it. They never want to look at that code again, right?
Oh, interesting.
That's a pretty common pattern. People reach the end, they finish their thesis, they're burned out, they put the code on GitHub, but it doesn't have a README, it doesn't have tests, nobody knows how to run it. All of the evidence of its capabilities are written into a PDF, but it's dead on the vine. Nobody can actually run that code anymore.
Wow.
We found out that academics were not necessarily a good target audience for us because that sort of work doesn't function like open source where people are picking it up and carrying it and forking it and creating derivative versions. So we started to shift more into focusing on open source tinkerers. And then, of course, Stable Diffusion came out around August of 2022. And that's when Replicate really took off. We were one of the first platforms where you could easily type in a text prompt on a website and generate images with it.
So talk about that evolution. I'm sure there were many challenges along the way. The pivot from focusing on academia and research and realizing that maybe this is not the core audience for this product. I'm sure making those pivots and on the development of the product itself, there were technical challenges. It is early machine learning. Like, can you share any of the technical challenges from evolving the product into what it is now?
Sure. In the early days, Replicate was just a website that you could go to and you could fill out a form. So it was a proof of concept. But then we had people who were reverse engineering our website, writing code to scrape, basically like writing a headless browser code to fill out the form and basically turning it into an API without our consent. But that's a good sign because it's, wow, people like this thing enough that they actually want to write some automation around it to use it like an API.
Yeah.
And we had an early artist, a digital artist named Dribnet, who created these models called Pixray, which were this series of early image generation models. And Dribnet was like, can I just pay you thousands of dollars to turn this into an API for me so that I'm not reverse engineering it? And we're like, I think we just found our first customer.
Oh.
We decided to actually turn Replicate into a cloud-hosted API at that point. In the beginning, we thought that Replicate would be a place to collaborate on the design and development process of AI models, but we realized is that everyone was really having challenges hosting and running them. So we made it easy to push an AI model up to the cloud and then have an automatically generated API for it. That was one of the early insights that helped us figure out what problems people actually needed us to solve.
Yeah, that is fascinating. I love it that it was accidental, but not really. Like you knew what your users were doing and you're like, that is a good pivot into how to start a business and focus on your user feedback to guide a business.
It was a good feeling, yeah, to have somebody scraping our website and using it in this sort of unintended way, but it was a way that we actually hoped things would go.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about open source. How do you balance leveraging open source technologies at the same time you're developing these proprietary solutions, like to be able to provide this API access for folks? I want to know a bit about the company's philosophy on contribution back to open source. I know you personally are a massive open source person, champion for open source for years.
Yeah.
As a company, Replicate, what do you think about that? And how do you balance that proprietary versus open source technologies?
Yeah, we basically open source everything that we can that it makes sense to. We're not really into secret sauce, and I think that's one of our biggest differentiators among our competitors right now, is that there's so many AI providers right now that are just, they're black box, right? You throw an input at them and something comes back and you don't really know.
You don't know how that happened.
You don't know how that happened. You don't know if the quality of that is going to change over time, especially with a lot of these image generation models. They do this thing called quantization, which is a way of making the model go faster by changing math performed inside the model. What usually happens when you quantize a model is it's faster, but the outputs are not as high quality. So when you are using an image generation model as a customer, you have to do a little bit of research to know if you're going with different AI providers, what are they doing under the hood that is affecting the quality of the outputs? And so with Replicate, one of the things that's been really important to us is to just have the source available for all of the models that we run. We do have some private repos like our API and our website. But I think part of the challenge of building all of these things is not that we wrote some really special secret code. It's more like we've gone through the hard work of building an entire piece of infrastructure that can handle all of the load of a bunch of requests coming in, keeping them in a queue, storing them in a database, and shuttling things around. And so it's okay for us to open source all of the individual components of that, knowing that the task of trying to put them all together and replicate from scratch is like a Herculean task. So we're not afraid of sharing the code. And in a lot of cases, especially if we're sharing code for open source models, we get feedback from the community and we get contributions from the community. We're engaging with the people who are using our software in a way that we otherwise wouldn't be if we were just a black box.
That was my follow-up question. Have you actually seen a lot of contributions from the community then? Once everything is like, you have that open source first mentality.
Yeah.
That's awesome. You offer the features, key features is fine-tuning, right? Custom model deployment.
Yeah.
There, like you said, there's a ton of solutions out there. And we'll talk a little bit about key differentiators. I'd love to see from your personal experience, talking to the users, knowing your community, any interesting use cases that you're like. I love the story of your original artist. That's epic. I'm going to look them up and see what they were making because that's really cool. Yeah. But I don't know if recently there's anything that's caught your attention.
Yeah, there's a lot of really cool multimodal models coming out. Those are models that can deal not just with images or with text, but both together. So we've seen this with Claude and OpenAI where you can throw an image at it and you can say, here's a photo of my refrigerator. Tell me how to make dinner tonight or whatever. Those things are really powerful. I think video generation models are what are going to be happening next. Of course, OpenAI has Sora, but there are a lot of really exciting open source video generation models coming out. So it's going to be possible to take a starting image that either a real photograph or an image that you generated with another AI model and turn it into video by guiding it with a text prompt. So that sounds magical now, but I think a few months from now, it's going to be like table stakes. Everyone's going to be doing that sort of thing. So that's what I think is coming very soon. Interesting things that people are doing right now with Replicate. There's a lot of image model fine-tuning going on. So it's become really easy to create a model that can generate images of yourself. So I have this Zeke model. Flux is this really amazing open source model created by the original authors of Stable Diffusion. They left Stability AI, formed their own company called Black Forest Labs, and released a new model called Flux, which is based on the work that they did on Stable Diffusion. And it just blows Stable Diffusion out of the water.
You fine-tune the Zeke model. What does the Zeke model do?
I took a few pictures of myself from different angles and threw it into this training process. And the cool thing about Replicate is you can do a lot of the stuff on the web. You take some images, drop them onto a form, hit train, and then 10 minutes later, you have a model that can generate images of you. You write the prompt and say, Zeke sitting in a podcast booth with a microphone in front of him, and it just works. Of course, usually you have to try a few times to get it right, but you can do that on the website. One of the really powerful things and where the business cases come into play is that you can do all these things with an API too, even the creating of the models. We have a lot of customers who are building products. For example, one of the products is a tool for staging apartment listings with furniture. The company will take a bunch of empty photos or even a video of an empty apartment, and then they use these models to dynamically fill the spaces with beautiful plants and furniture to help spark the imagination of what would this place actually look like if it had furniture? People are building those kinds of products on top of Replicate, and they're able to do it in a fully automated way where they can create thousands of models programmatically on the fly.
That is so cool. I was thinking about that because if you're a massive broker and you have, I don't know, 1,000 properties or you're doing this massive development,
Yeah.
you want to, that is so cool. That is a really cool use case. I love that. Anything from the community that are doing for personal use, besides your model, which I have to check out. Is it open source?
It is open source. Actually, I used GitHub Actions. I used to work at Heroku and NPM. Before GitHub Actions came along, I had this whole convoluted process that I would use, a combination of creating cron jobs on Heroku to run every hour to publish NPM packages for me. And now, of course, GitHub Actions does all of that. For my Flux fine-tuned model, I keep all of my training data in a GitHub repository. If I find out, there's actually a virtuous cycle where if you generate an image with your model and you're like, oh, that looks really cool, you can actually use that output as training data for another run to retrain the model to make it even better.
Wow.
That's called using synthetic data. A lot of people who are fine-tuning models will actually use the model to generate a bunch of data, pick out the good stuff, and put it back into the training process and rinse and repeat. Because all of my Zeke images are in a GitHub repo, all I have to do is drop the file into my repo, go to the Actions tab on GitHub, and hit retrain. It has all of the code for talking to the Replicate API to retrain a new version of my model. You get the benefit of having the whole paper trail of keeping your code or your training data inside of GitHub and having an automated connection to Replicate, which I love.
That is awesome. Talk about optimization, like on the fly.
Yeah.
See, this is so interesting. I think let's make a deal. For our audience, for our viewer who's watching right now, Zeke, you're going to share a demo with me, right? And then I'm going to publish it together with this conversation.
Okay.
Because I want people to see it. Are you going to demo the Zeke model there? Maybe?
Yeah, for sure.
That'd be super, super great. Tell me about how people can start trying out Replicate. How can they get involved? If someone is actually really deep into this particular topic and they maybe want to contribute somehow to the open source portions of it, where do we go? How do we do it?
Yeah, at replicate.com/explore, we have featured models. Replicate is not just this particular kind of model. We have language models, image models, vision models, and soon video models. That webpage is the best place to see what's being featured right now. The cool thing about Replicate is you can tinker around on the website without having to install any software. You just click around, you try a model. My workflow, even though I know how to write code and interact with APIs, I still always start on the website. So I'll find a model that was featured on Twitter or something, and then if it's an open source model, I can find it on Replicate as well. I'll search for the model name. It's right there in the browser. I can click around, run it, and then every time you run a model, you can switch over to a tab that shows you how to do that exact same thing in code with Node.
You got a little playground that's attached.
I have a playground.
Cool.
Yeah.
That is cool.
That makes it really easy to click around, get to something that you like. I'm going to change this input a little bit. I'm going to tweak this. And then you see an image that you like, or you see an output that you like. And then you're like, that's a good starting point to take this out of the browser and start running it in code.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That is really cool.
Yeah.
That is very unique. Okay, so folks,
replicate.com/explorer.
And if you see, this is so cool because now if you're seeing like something trending on threads or something and you want to test it out, that is right there and you can just try it out, figure it out. Why do you think it's important? And I love the options. So important for people that are adopting this, right? Like it's a specific use case for the apartment person that's staging versus Zeke that wants to see what Zeke will look like in the moon. If somebody's watching this and they're thinking about maybe they'd rather not focus on fine-tuning, what is the upside of doing this, I think, for a developer? Having the APIs, making it more accessible for people to do it. You don't have to worry about, you've done the hard work, the infrastructure is there. But what do you think regular developers should start looking at this and adopting this into whatever they're building?
Yeah, I think it's pretty common to start with OpenAI or Anthropic Claude for doing any kind of language model stuff. But something that we often see is we'll have customers who started out running OpenAI, they built a product using it, and then realized that it's too expensive for their needs. So in a lot of cases, the OpenAI models are state-of-the-art. Claude Sonnet, as we heard in the keynote this morning, for generating code. But for a lot of use cases, you don't need the absolute fastest, fanciest model there is, especially if you are starting to build a business and realizing that your costs are too high. So we have a lot of people who switch to a model like Llama from Meta or Mistral because it's able to do whatever they need for their business, but at a much lower price point. That's one of the draws for developers to move to open source models that in many cases are good enough for their needs.
If you don't need a tank to do a job that a car can do, don't get the tank, especially if you got to pay for the tank.
Well, start with the tank. If it works and your product starts to get traction and you actually have something that's really working, then you can start to look at optimizing the costs and moving to more efficient models.
Besides the video, which is like the next frontier, and I've seen some of the latest in the Zapcon, and they're impressive. In a year, we'll be generating this. You send me what you want to say. I'll add an intro, and next thing you know, we're two avatars doing a podcast.
Yeah.
But what else is exciting for you in this landscape? What do you think that's coming up that you're like, you know what, that's going to be interesting?
Yeah, it's already here, but I think the thing that I'm most excited about is, okay, backing up, thinking about the last 10, 12 years of my career, I've been working for all these internet infrastructure type services, Heroku, GitHub, NPM, now Replicate. They all exist to make it easier for developers to get things done. And I've worked at these places not because I'm a good developer or a smart engineer. It's more like I want to be creative with computers. This stuff is hard. It should be easier. And those are all companies that I have loved and appreciated because they've done something to make the process easier for regular people. The next sort of logical evolution of that in my mind is now we are programming, as they said this morning, in natural language. I always say programming in English, but we saw in a demo this morning, somebody typed instructions into Copilot in Hindi, and sure enough, it did the right thing.
Yeah.
With my background working on internationalization at GitHub, it all weaves together where I don't have a lot of loyalty to a specific programming language.
Right.
I did when I was younger. Ruby on Rails, like Ruby's the best programming language or whatever. It's the most sort of glamorous looking language. But like over time, you start to realize like, they're different tools for different jobs. And you choose the one that's appropriate for your needs. And what we're starting to see is the whole landscape is getting leveled out to the point where these language models are trained on so much programming code that they're able to write code in all these different languages. Now the process of software development is more of a natural language-based interaction where a lot of the drudgery of writing the code is done by the language model, and it's up to the human to guide and direct the process and think more abstractly about the goal. I love that.
It was built for you.
Yeah, it was built for me. Like, I don't even want to write code. I want to get something else done, and code has been like the means to an end.
Yeah.
And now we have an abstraction layer over that in the form of language models, which is obviously it's everything that's being talked about at GitHub Universe today is all about AI. So it's not even that it's coming, it's already here. It's just going to get better.
100%. It's evolving at a speed that's just wild. I appreciate that because I feel like you having that layer of abstraction frees up your creativity to see things from a different point of view. I think a lot of times engineers get bogged down on like whatever the technical requirement, like the mountain. Can I get over the mountain before I even visualize what the mountain will look like?
Yeah.
But if you have less fear about how you're going to build that because you know you can lean onto like would be an assistant like Copilot, or you know that there are models that can help you get there. Or you don't even have to worry about if you can write Ruby on Rails. If you're a Pythonist, like those things are gonna be not like trivial details. It's more about like the idea.
Yeah.
And the execution, you lean into these agents to help you. That is the future.
It's so exciting.
The future is not.
Just one more thing. Doesn't even have to do with Replicate or anything, but there's this open source journalist named Simon Willison who's always like playing with language models and discovering new things. And he published this blog post about using Google's Gemini model to interpret a video. So he had a bunch of content in emails in Gmail.
Okay.
And in 2024, if you want to write code that downloads your Gmail emails, that's super hard to do.
Yeah.
All he had to do was record his screen with QuickTime, click through the emails, scroll up and down in his browser, take that screencast, dump it into the Gemini model and say, turn everything you saw into a JSON file. And it just came out.
Fantastical.
It's just there's so many things that just used to be so difficult to do. Now we have entirely different ways of solving those problems. We're just starting to see how powerful these things are and how much we can do with them.
This is fascinating. See, we met in 2017, so 7 years ago?
Yeah.
You imagine us having this conversation 7 years from now? No, it'll be the AI. But I think it's going to be it's already such a part of our life, but then it's not even going to be a conversation needed because it's just the way things are built. It's the way that we work.
Yeah. I think about that with my children a lot. They ask me all these really interesting questions. One of my kids is really into gardening now, and he was asking about when is the season to plant carrot seeds. I was thinking back to when I was a kid. If I had a question like that, we would look in the Encyclopedia Britannica,
right?
And if the answer wasn't there, my dad would call the library, and they would say, we'll research it for you and we'll call you back in 20 minutes. Now it's like when kids want access to information, they have it. My kids always make fun of Google when you're like talking, you're like, hey, Google, and it's not very good at knowing what you're talking about. But when they use OpenAI, the speech mode, and you have a continuous conversation with it.
That's my
Just seeing them learn from it is mind-blowing. They're set up for a whole new level of access to information that is pretty inspiring.
Absolutely. I think that's one of the best things about this fourth industrial revolution or whatever the trendy folks call it, is access. Putting that technology into the hands of little people, and they're going to grow up thinking, like, we had dreamers in our generation, but I think the dreams that our kids can have now are beyond anything we could have ever imagined for ourselves. That's so good. Zeke, you're epic. I've loved having you here. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for sharing Replicate. Folks, go ahead and try it, replicate.com, right?
Yeah.
You can check out which model you want to work with. I love that there is a sandbox or a playground that you can actually see the code. That's so good because even though we have things that can do these things for us, I think it's important that we know how. That's going to help you arrive at something that you actually can use quicker. Fantastic. Give it a go. After this, I'm going to be showing a clip of an amazing demo by Zeke. So you get to see it in action. How can people find you on social if they want to follow you? I'm
Zeke on GitHub and X, Zeke.
All right, perfect. You've been generating these images that you've been sharing. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, check it out. Go to X/Zeke, and you'll see the images I'm talking about. Are they generated by the Zeke model?
Usually.
There's like the very colorful, like pop art type of, those are cool. All the things we can do.
Amazing.
Thank you so much, Zeke, again, for being here. I can't wait till we have this conversation again in a couple of months. Folks, stay tuned for the demo video. If you want to test out Replicate, go to replicate.com and give it a go.
Thank you. Hey party people. So recently I was at GitHub Universe in San Francisco meeting with Andrea Griffiths on the DevRel team there. And we were talking about fine-tuning image models. Here's what I was saying. So for my Flux fine-tuned model, I keep all of my training data in a GitHub repository. And if I find out, there's actually kind of like a virtuous cycle where if you generate an image with your model and you're like, oh, that looks really cool, you can actually use that output as training data for another run to retrain the model to make it even better.
Wow. So
that's called using synthetic data. So a lot of people who are fine-tuning models will actually use the model to generate a bunch of data and pick out the good stuff and train it, put it back into the training process and rinse and repeat. So because of all of my Zeke images are in a GitHub repo, all I have to do is drop the file into my repo, go to the Actions tab on GitHub, and hit retrain, and it has all the code for talking to the Replicate API to retrain a new version of my model. So it's like you get the benefit of like having the whole paper trail of keeping your code or your training data inside of GitHub, and then having like an automated connection to Replicate, which I love.
That is awesome. Talk about optimization, like on the fly.
Yeah.
That is really, really neat.
Yeah.
See, this is so interesting. Like, we need to see a demo. So I think let's make a deal. For our audience, for our viewer who's watching right now, Zeke, you're going to share a demo with me, right? And then I'm going to publish it together with this conversation.
Okay, so she put me on the spot, asked me to make a demo. So let's do the demo. I want to talk a little bit about what Flux is. So if you haven't heard of it, Flux is a relatively new open source image generation model that is state-of-the-art, fast, generates really high-quality images. And one of the exciting things about it is that you can create fine-tunes of the model with your own data to create new images that mimic a certain style of an object or a person. So I wrote a blog post in August about how to go through this process, and this blog post is pretty hand-holdy, tells you how to do this in detail, but the gist is you find some images of yourself, you upload them on a website, and you wait 20 minutes or so, you pay $2 or $3 for the compute time, and you end up with a model that can generate images of you. So the one that I was talking about with Andrea is called Zeke Flux, and as long as I include the word Ziki, which is called the trigger word in my text prompt, it'll generate an image that often looks like me. And one of the cool things about Flux is that it can actually do text pretty well. So here I actually asked it to draw a handwritten sign that says fine-tuning with Flux, and that looks pretty good. So another thing that I mentioned when I was talking to Andrea is using synthetic training data. So you might start with some real photos of yourself, but maybe you don't have enough interesting photos of yourself, or you're not able to find the right data. One thing you can do is get started fine-tuning your own model, and then actually run the model. Like, let's say I was running this Zeke Flux model, and I thought, wow, that looks like a really cool picture of me. I probably wouldn't use this one because it doesn't really look like me super closely, but if I just keep running it until I get an output that I like, I can actually download that file and then reuse it in the training process to improve the model to make it look more like me. So there's another blog post about doing that on the Replicate blog. And then the other thing I mentioned when I was talking to Andrea was using GitHub Actions workflow. So I have this GitHub repository, it's public, under Zeke Flux Fine-Tune Action. And it's really easy to use. All you have to do is fork the repo, go into the data directory, and the data in there is me. So you're gonna wanna just delete all those files and replace them with images of yourself or your concept, whatever thing you wanna fine tune. And then once you've done that, you go over to the Replicate website, you grab an API token, generate one here, call it Flux Fine-Tune Action, copy it, take it back to your repository, go into the Settings tab, go into Secrets and Variables, Actions, and add it here, call it Replicate API token. And that's all you need to do. And now you have this thing where you can go to the Actions tab and you can run the workflow. So there's a couple things you have to provide here, which is, one is, what is the name of the model on Replicate that you want to push to? Another is choosing the trigger word, so like Zeke, for instance. And then you want to choose a number of training steps, which determines how much of a process the training process goes through. Sorry, that wasn't very articulate. How long to train the model, basically. And there's kind of a sweet spot. If you look on the trainer page, let's see, there it is. There's some detail here about the ideal number of steps. So recommended range is 500 to 4,000. I think I've used 1,000 usually, and that works out pretty well. So you'll need to play with it. 100 is not enough and you won't get great results. And then you just hit run, and it runs this process on the GitHub Actions platform using this workflow, which basically does the dirty work of talking to Replicate's API for you. And then when this completes, you now have a new version of your model on Replicate, which you can run here right inside your browser. And then when you find a prompt that's working pretty well for you and you want to start using it in code in your software, you can actually choose one of these tabs like Node.js, and here is a code snippet that generates the same inputs that were used to generate this image. And of course, there's also support for Python, and you can run it with curl and other programming languages. So hopefully that's useful. It's super fun and easy to get started. The best way, if you're not familiar with this stuff yet, is to go to the Replicate blog and check out the fine-tuning posts there. Thanks for watching. Thanks, Andrea, for putting me on the spot. And I'll see you at the next universe. Bye.